Ones that were appointed by Barack Hussein Obama and Biden, you can have the greatest case ever. They're going to rule against you. They always do.
Let's start with exactly what Donald Trump said, in his own words, in the Oval Office. You have the ones that were appointed by Barack Hussein Obama and Biden. I don't care how good your case is. You can have the greatest case ever. They're going to rule against you. They always do. And then this. The Republicans tend to be very different. They want to show how honorable they are, so a man can appoint them and they can rule against him. We're so proud we ruled against Trump. We're so proud. We're above it. And then the final line, the one that tells you everything. There are those that say that's wonderful, and there are those that say they're so stupid. They're so stupid when they rule against me.
They want to show how honorable they are. So a man can appoint them and they can rule against him. It's so proud of it. There's those that say that's wonderful, and there are those that say they're so stupid.
It's me, but so wonderful when they don't. 60 seconds. That's all it took. And in those 60 seconds, Trump said something that no president in American history had said quite so plainly from the Oval Office. That judges should be evaluated not by whether they followed the law, but by whether they ruled in his favor. Now, the same morning those words were said, Trump was heading to the Supreme Court for oral arguments on birthright citizenship, a case that legal scholars call one of the most consequential constitutional questions in a generation. And yesterday, the day before those arguments, a federal court halted construction of Trump's $400 million White House ballroom, ruled that the president simply does not have the authority to fund a project of that scale without congressional approval. 2 courtrooms, 1 presidency, and a question that goes all the way to the foundation of how this country was designed. That's what we're talking about today. First, what Trump actually said about judges and why it matters more than it sounds. When most people hear a politician complain about judges, they file it under standard political grievance and move on. But what Trump said in that clip is different, and it's worth slowing down on. He made 3 separate arguments in under a minute. Argument 1, Democrat-appointed judges will always rule against him, regardless of the merits of his case. Argument 2, Republican-appointed judges who rule against him are doing it to prove their independence, which he calls foolish vanity. Argument 3, the only meaningful metric for a judge's quality is the outcome they produce for him specifically. Now look at what's missing from all 3 arguments: the law, the Constitution, the facts of any specific case. None of those things appear anywhere in his framework for evaluating judges. The only variable that matters is, did they rule for me or against me? This is not a political argument. This is actually a claim about what courts are for. Trump is saying, openly, from the Oval Office, that courts exist to validate the position of whoever holds executive power, and judges who don't do that are either corrupted by ideology or performing false honor. Here's why that matters for an ordinary person watching this. If you are ever in a courtroom, not for politics, not for anything grand, just a property dispute, a contract disagreement, a custody case, the one thing you are counting on is that the judge is evaluating your case on its merits, not on who appointed them, not on who you voted for, on the facts and the law. The moment a sitting president says publicly that judges rule based on who appointed them rather than what the law says, he is not just attacking his opponents. He is undermining the premise that makes courts worth going.
Let me back up a little bit, if I may, Willie, and give you some history. I know it's early for history, but here we go. Yeah, so in 1857, the Supreme Court decided what turned out to be one of its most repulsive decisions, Dred Scott.
Now, the birthright citizenship case, what it is, and why it matters to every single person watching. The same morning Trump made those comments about judges, he went to the Supreme Court for oral arguments on birthright citizenship. To understand what's actually being argued, you need about 2 minutes of history. In 1857, the Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott case. It ruled that Black people were not and could never be citizens of the United States. It is widely considered the most repulsive decision in the court's history. It helped push the country towards civil war. In 1868, 11 years later, the United States enacted the 14th Amendment, specifically to overturn Dred Scott, to make permanent what the Civil War had established, that any person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. Full stop. The key phrase in the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. That phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is the one being argued about today. Trump's executive order says that children born in America to undocumented parents or to parents on temporary visas are not fully subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore are not automatically citizens. His critics say that argument contradicts 157 years of constitutional history, and they have a Supreme Court case on their side. In 1898, Wong Kim Ark, a man born in San Francisco to Chinese parents who were not American citizens. The Supreme Court ruled 6-2 that he was an American citizen because he was born on American soil. That case has been the governing law for over 125 years. Congress in 1952 also passed a statute that echoed the exact words of the 14th Amendment, further cementing this right. So what's actually being asked in that courtroom? Not just whether birthright citizenship survives. That question has been answered, repeatedly, for over a century. The real question being asked is, can a president unilaterally reinterpret a constitutional amendment through an executive order? What this means for an ordinary person, let's bring this down to ground level, because this isn't abstract. If you are a child born in this country to parents who came here without documentation, or on a work visa, or a student visa, this executive order, if it stands, says you are not an American citizen, even if you were born here, even if this is the only country you have ever known. That's not a policy debate. That is a question about who belongs, and it goes further than immigration. Because the mechanism being tested here, whether a president can redefine a constitutional right through executive order, applies to every other constitutional right too. The 14th Amendment doesn't just cover citizenship. It's the amendment that also covers equal protection under the law, due process, a legal foundation of civil rights law. If the principle holds that a president can reinterpret the 14th Amendment by executive order, that same logic could be applied to other rights that amendment protects. That's why constitutional lawyers on both sides of the political aisle have called this one of the highest stakes cases in a generation. Legal expert Chuck Rosenberg put it plainly. We have a Supreme Court case that is almost entirely on point. We have Congress in 1952 enacting a statute that echoed the words of the 14th Amendment and guaranteeing this right of citizenship. Norm Eisen, who argued this case as co-counsel, the Constitution and the 14th Amendment make that choice. Donald Trump doesn't get to choose which babies born here are citizens. The White House ballroom and the bigger pattern. Now let's talk about the ruling that happened the day before the Supreme Court arguments, because it connects directly to everything we've been discussing. A federal judge ordered an immediate halt to construction of Trump's proposed 90,000 square foot White House ballroom. The judge's ruling was specific. The president lacks the authority to fund a $400 million project through private donations. He has no statutory power for a project of that scale without congressional approval. On the surface, this sounds like a story about a building. It isn't. It's a story about whether a president can bypass Congress on matters of spending and construction, and whether private money can be used to fund public infrastructure without legislative oversight. The answer the court gave was no. Now connect that to what Chuck Rosenberg said in the broadcast, something that doesn't get quoted enough. He said, over the last half-century, there has been an accretion of power in the executive. At the same time, we see Congress ceding its power over and over again, in terms of funding, in terms of war-making authority. Congress has ceded the field to the president. This is the structural context that matters. The reason so many of these battles are ending up in courts right now is not just because of Trump specifically. It's because Congress, over decades, across both parties, has gradually handed more and more power to the executive branch. And when Congress doesn't check the president, the courts become the only institution left that can. As Rosenberg said, if you want to check a president, the place you go is to court. That's not a partisan statement. That's a description of how the system was designed to function when one branch stops doing its job. Stupid or wonderful, and what Trump's judge logic tells us about the next 4 years. Now let's come back to where we started, because Trump's comments about judges aren't separate from the birthright citizenship case or the ballroom ruling. They're the frame through which he sees all of it. When Trump says Republican judges who rule against him are stupid, he's not just venting frustration. He is articulating a philosophy. The philosophy is loyalty to the executive should be the organizing principle of the judiciary. Every authoritarian government in history has started from this exact position, not by abolishing courts, but by gradually redefining what courts are for. First, you say the courts are biased against you. Then, you say the good judges are the ones who rule in your favor. Then you start appointing judges on that explicit basis. Then the courts stop being courts. We are not saying that's where America is headed. We are saying that's the direction the words point. Here's the practical impact on the days ahead. The Supreme Court is expected to rule on birthright citizenship. Most legal observers, including those who are not sympathetic to Trump's broader agenda, expect the court to reject the executive order. The legal case against it is that strong. Wong Kim Ark has been settled law for 127 years. But here's what matters more than the outcome of that specific case. If the court rules against Trump, and Trump has already signaled how he categorizes judges who do that, what does that mean for how he responds? Does he comply immediately? Does he find new executive mechanisms? Does he escalate his public attacks on the judiciary? And if the courts are the last functioning check on executive power, as Rosenberg described, and public trust in courts erodes because a president tells millions of his supporters that those courts are politically compromised, what's left? That's the question that lives underneath all of these individual cases. Not just birthright citizenship, not just a ballroom, but what happens to a democracy when the executive branch decides the judiciary is legitimate only when it agrees with him? The final frame. Back to those 60 seconds Trump said, "You can have the greatest case ever. They're going to rule against you. They always do." Here's the thing about that claim. It's worth actually checking. Because if Democrat-appointed judges were ruling against Trump in every single case, regardless of the law, that would be a real problem. That would mean the judiciary had been fully politicized and was operating as an arm of the opposition party. But that's not what the record shows. Trump has won significant cases before Democrat-appointed judges. He has lost cases before judges he appointed. The Supreme Court, with 3 justices he nominated, has ruled against him on multiple occasions, including on questions of executive power. The unanimous rulings against certain executive overreaches have come from courts across the ideological spectrum. The data doesn't support the claim that outcomes are determined by who appointed the judge. What it does support is something simpler, that in a constitutional democracy, courts apply law, and sometimes, regardless of who appointed the judge, the law says no. That's not a bug. That's the whole point. Rosenberg said something quietly important in that broadcast. Our laws, our Constitution, will inform the judgment of the court today, not the president's preferences, not his judgment of which judges are stupid or wonderful. The law. And on the morning Trump walked into that Supreme Court building, past justices he appointed, past justices his predecessors appointed, the Constitution was the same document it has been since 1868. The 14th Amendment said the same words it has always said. The court doesn't care who appointed them. That's not a betrayal. That's the job. And for an ordinary person watching all of this unfold, that's actually the most reassuring thing about today. Not that any particular outcome is guaranteed, but that the process is still running. Courts are still ruling. Judges are still reading the law, even when a president calls them stupid for doing it. What's coming? The days ahead. The Supreme Court's birthright citizenship ruling is expected in the coming months. Watch for three things. 1. Does the court reject the executive order entirely, or does it leave a narrow door open by sending parts of the case back to lower courts? That distinction will matter enormously for how the administration responds. 2. How does Trump react publicly to the ruling? And does his reaction escalate the confrontation with the judiciary or de-escalate it? His comments about judges in the Oval Office suggest the former is more likely. 3. Congress. Rosenberg's point about Congress ceding power over decades is the structural issue that outlasts any single administration. If courts become the only functioning check on executive power, that's a problem regardless of who the president is. The question for the days ahead is whether any bipartisan effort emerges to restore congressional oversight, or whether the pattern of executive expansion continues. The ballroom case, the birthright case, the judge comments, they are not separate stories. They are one story about where the lines are, who is drawing them, and whether those lines hold. The Constitution drew its lines in 1868. They've held for 157 years. The court will tell us in the months ahead whether they still do.